Okay, so that looks like the lineup. Which, wow, thank you all for coming. This is already far more people than I expected. So I was ready to go ahead of it, even if there was one person here. So the fact that you've all made this worth my while is amazing. So thank you all. So welcome to this panel called "Soul of an Old Machine: Why Mecha Hits Different Than Other Anime." Calling it a panel is a little bit of a misnomer. I am going to be kind of treating this a little bit more like an informative lecture, and the whole idea here basically being about we're going to talk about like how Mecha comes about, why it's a big deal, why people like it, and just afterwards, once I'm done yapping about it for a little while, hopefully there'll be some time to take some questions. So for anyone who heard the term lecture and was ready to run out the door, I promise this will be interesting at the very least. I can try to make it entertaining as well, but it's just a case of there's a reason to be here, is all I'm saying. So just a quick primer on who I am and why I'm even here and why you may want to listen to what I have to say about this. My name is Matt Poulter. I am a PhD candidate in the Communication and Culture program at York University. It's actually a joint program between York and Ryerson. But more specifically, for the purposes of this thing, I'm a contract instructor at the Film Studies department at Carleton University, which is actually where I graduated both my bachelor and my master's from. I very specifically actually teach a course on anime at Carleton. So I had a vested reason in being at this convention. My research specialization is, wow, that's a hard word to say apparently, is on Japanese media. My master's work, for instance, was on transhumanism in the works of Mamoru Oshii, who directed Ghost in the Shell and all sorts of other stuff. I'm currently researching depictions of sexuality in anime and how oftentimes anime features sexuality being used as a weapon. So there's a lot of stuff about that. I talk about like the Bayonetta games and anime like Kill la Kill, stuff like that. So this is the long and short of why I am here talking to you today about Mecha. The other reason being that I am also a member of the Ottawa Gunpla Club, and we have regular meetups. We build Gundam kits and the like. At least a few people in here I can say are from that club, so thank you for coming out and supporting me. Several of us are volunteering at the Plamod booth, where you can actually go and try your hand at building a plastic model kit for the first time if you haven't done it before, or even if you have and just want to give that a try. So shameless plug for them before I get into the kind of the nitty-gritty of things. But to talk about Mecha, Mecha is a really interesting subgenre of anime in the sense that it's very, very intrinsically tied to Japanese media like manga and anime in a pretty big way. And even though Mecha isn't quite as popular nowadays as it was, like, say, during the heyday of like the 80s and the 90s, there are still Mecha shows coming out regularly. There's Mecha media coming out constantly. And it stayed a very long-lasting thing in Japanese media and especially anime. So there's a lot of reasoning behind that, and I think that's kind of what's fun to talk about, is kind of like, anytime something gets really popular, there's always a question of like, why? Why does something get popular? Why is it important to talk about? Why do people like this, basically? So we're going to get into that, and the main way that I think is best to get into that is this is going to be kind of a half and half deal. The first half is going to be talking about a little bit about the history of how Mecha comes to even happen, and then like kind of how Mecha becomes what it is today. And then I'm going to talk about sort of the why. Why does something like this get as big as it does? So Mecha history, as I've talked about, using this like very early screenshot from one of the first series out there. And when it comes time to talk about the history of Mecha, it really is kind of intrinsically tied with the history of the 1900s era of Japan. So oftentimes when we talk about Japanese history in, let's say, the 20th and going into the 21st century, we have to talk about effectively the periods of pre- and post-World War II Japan, and that's kind of what's important to know. I swear this is going to be relevant to giant robots blowing stuff up in a minute. Stay with me. Someone actually did fall asleep in a previous panel I was part of, so I'm hoping I can at least avoid that here. Talking about pre-war Japan, for those who don't know, a quick overview of that period of Japanese history. From the end of the Warring States period to the period called the Meiji Restoration, Japan was completely cut off from the rest of the world through their own policy. They became very insular. International ships were not allowed to dock and trade with them or anything, with some very small exceptions. Basically, feudalism reigned until the late 1800s, well past the point that most other cultures moved past feudalism and the like. until eventually, who came knocking but the Americans? Because, if you're ever going to have a culture that's going to wreck your day, historically, it's going to be one of two, and in this case, they got that one. So an American ship docks and basically says, let us in and let us trade with you, or we're going to blow your harbor to smithereens and lay siege to the country, and they had the guns to do it with. So Japan very quickly kind of faced this question of modernization around the time, and that then led to quite a few members of the country rebelling against the shogunate and the ruling class at the time, taking over the country in this event called the Meiji Restoration, talking about bringing Emperor Meiji to the throne. And what follows this is a mass period of urbanization in Japan. The Meiji Restoration sees them accept all kinds of modernization, like railways, the telegraph, so on and so forth. Like everyone knows Japanese rail when you talk about Japan in the present day, but this is around the time that they first even start having any of that at all. And the big emphasis on this is, understandably, they want to meet or even surpass the West when it comes to this technological dominance and power. And most significantly, their military also gets upgraded significantly, which is going to lead to some events coming very soon after this. But a very interesting note about this period of time is that because of the military upgrades, Japan is actually the first Eastern nation in that time period to defeat one of the big Western nations in a war, because a war actually does break out between Russia and Japan in 1904, and Japan wins, which is actually a thing that, among other things, is going to lead to the Russian Revolution and the Tsar getting overthrown. So it's all kind of interconnected by history. Then obviously, once we get into World War II era Japan, the big things to take away here is the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but with the atomic bomb. You all saw Oppenheimer statistically, so I imagine I don't need to go into this too much. But the point being is that Japan has a very interesting relationship with technology as a nation. They have, in many ways, really embraced it in a lot of ways that other nations haven't, but it's also often not necessarily been by choice, or at least not the choice of everybody involved with it. So this is why you can maybe see where I'm starting to go with this in terms of when we're going to talk about giant exploding robots. But just to go a little bit, when we talk about post-war Japan, because post-war Japan is effectively where we start to get things like anime, there's this big focus on industrialization to restore the economy in post-war Japan, and also this idea of export to the West, which is done especially because of the fact that America occupies Japan following the conclusion of World War II. And so there's this big push to westernize, big push to import like manufacturing techniques from the West and things like that. And this then leads to all kinds of technological production in Japan that really jumpstarts their economy. Very shortly after they start this, they end up becoming one of the world's leading manufacturers in things like automobiles and electronics and stuff. For many years, they actually are the leading manufacturer of stuff like this. So again, we have this very this very tragic, devastating event related to technology, then leading to a period of mass technicalization. So suffice it to say, this is a country that's going to have some maybe mixed feelings about the nature of technology. And don't worry, I'll read this out. You don't have to try to read that whole thing. But what's really interesting about this is at one point, giving a talk at TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, Mamoru Oshii, the director of Ghost in the Shell and Pat Labor, most specifically for this case, which is a very excellent Mecha series, actually commented on this part of time, saying that when I was a child, the country was poor because of the war. Then people eventually started getting TVs, fridges, a few cars and bicycles, etc. As time went on, new technologies foreshadowed a brighter future. The Japanese began to find an image of happiness in technology. I felt that it was wonderful at the time, and I basically still do. Looking at technology as a threat to humanity is too extreme a view. We need to think about how we can adapt to new technology, not demonize it. Technology has now become something within humanity. Like it or not, we can't live without it. Very humorously, when someone pointed out that a lot of his movies about technology are very dystopian, he then commented, "I'm not saying we're all gonna like it." So, but when talking about where Mecha comes in, the very first instance we really get of what would go on to define the Mecha as a genre comes in 1956. So yes, Mecha, as even like kind of the proto version, is in fact that old. We get the release of a manga by artist Mitsuteru Yokoyama called Tetsujin 28 Go. Or, for those who were around for when this got a very limited broadcast in North America at the time, this was known as Gigantor, which you may have heard of. This was brought to the West, so it was both debuted in 1963 and brought to the West the same year, thanks in no small part to the first international release at the time of another franchise you probably heard of called Astro Boy. They were both the same year. So Tetsujin 28 Go is kind of very much the prototype for Mecha, in the sense that it is the first series to feature a giant robot as its central thing. You know, the Tetsujin 28 is literally the name of the robot, or Gigantor in the US version. And in this case, it is a giant robot meant to defend the world from evil forces who are very heavily hinted to be former Nazis. And it's controlled by remote control on the ground by a little boy. So very much kind of has that like toy-like aspect to it, sort of thing, and is very much targeted towards kids. It ends up being very successful in Japan. It does kind of kick off this whole fascination with giant robots. It gets a bit of a cult following in the West from people who watched it as kids, there are other versions of this story that later do get licensed here and whatnot, but it kind of remains a bit of an underground hit in a lot of ways, or at least here. Japan's bigger. However, then we get the big one. In 1972, we get the creator, Go Nagai, who has created, honestly, a hell of a lot of different anime genres, just basically based on whatever he was fascinated by today. He's also kind of responsible for Magical Girl being what it is today, even though in that case he drew transformation sequences purely as an excuse to have women being naked. Fascinating individual, I recommend reading up on him. But at one point in 1972, Go Nagai, who is a big fan of Astro Boy and Gigantor, is stuck in a traffic jam and looks back at the cars that are stuck behind him and goes, man, I imagine they would really love a way to just like move around the traffic and get past it. And then he goes, I got it. What if there was a giant robot, but someone was inside driving it like a car? That's literally the creation process for what brings out Mazinger Z, which then goes on to become a massive hit in Japan, not just from the manga, but from anime adaptations. It's still getting anime adaptations and references to this day. Tons of merchandise, the toy line is extensive, so on and so forth. It's an actual, legitimately like massive hit as it comes out. And Mazinger Z is really going to kind of come to define the next couple of eras of Mecha, sort of thing, and it really sets us up for what's to come. Next up, following the year after, or maybe 2 years after. I swear I know time. And funnily enough, we get a series that has not necessarily broken through to the West in quite as much, and that the releases here have been fairly limited, but is absolutely important to talk about, is Getter Robo by Ken Ishikawa. Fun fact, also featuring mecha designs by Go Nagai, because the man is really pretty much responsible for creating so many things that anime loves. But at this point, Getter Robo is created because Ken Ishikawa and Go Nagai are out and about and they see a car accident. And they've been trying to brainstorm some stuff for a new giant robot show they're doing, and they see the cars stuck together and they go, that's it. 3 robots smash into each other to make a bigger robot. That is literally how it happens. I'm not even exaggerating. That is the story. So if you've seen anything like Power Rangers or anything else that literally features robots that combine into each other, you have a single Japanese car wreck to thank for that becoming a thing. So, Getter Robo is an excellent series, by the way. I really recommend checking it out if you haven't. One of the big things about this, and this is actually kind of a through line of a lot of Nagai's design work, but Ken Ishikawa really leans into it as well, is that despite the robots being the centerpiece of it and very much like the really cool aspect of it, the robots also look demonic. And this, you can kind of see an example of the Getter in the background that like it looks scary. And this is kind of an example of that duality I'm talking about here, where Japan has this really like disparate reaction, kind of like history with technology where it's amazing and advanced, but also, oh my God, it blew us up. So this is where we can kind of start to see those sensibilities coming into this. Mazinger does this as well, but Getter Robo really leans into the demonic aspect of Mecha. So it's important to note. And this is also a series that continued on even past the unfortunate death of Ken Ishikawa. It's continued to get anime references, spin-off manga, so on and so forth. And Getter Robo is also a giant hit in Japan and some other countries where the show is licensed for. Actually, the theme song to Getter Robo is quite often used in movies like Kung Fu Hustle and Shaolin Soccer by Stephen Chow, who the director is like a very huge Getter fan, because I believe it aired in his native Taiwan, I want to say, but anyway, here we go. So through those and the series that come afterwards, we get the creation of what is often referred to as giant robot, or more specifically, super robot. This is where the technology leads to these robots that are effectively superheroes in piloted robot form. They have massive world-saving powers. These are things that are literally taller than a skyscraper. There's, the exquisitely animated and really drawn out sequences where the pilot gets in the robot. and then goes to town and saves the world. Anyone familiar with Evangelion has almost certainly seen like one of the most famous like kind of send-offs of this and things that actively like kind of play with that whole notion. And this ends up being the big thing in Mecha for quite a while, until we get to a little franchise you might have heard of, I don't know, called Mobile Suit Gundam. And this is where series creator Yoshiyuki Tomino, fascinating individual if you ever get a chance to read up on the man, basically creates this because he's tired of super robot tropes. And he creates this because he wants to tell something that is effectively a war story involving giant robots. This is less superheroic, it's less good versus evil, it's more like there is war going on, war is always bad because innocent people are caught in the crossfire all the time, and it's being committed by giant robots, in this case called mobile suits. Tomino very specifically draws influence from things like the powered armor featured in the novel Starship Troopers. So we see even here that like, as much as I think some people tend to think of the kind of interplay between like Western media and Japanese media as being very modern. It's not. It's been a thing forever. Osamu Tezuka quite literally based Astro Boy off of Superman when creating that character. So it's been a thing forever. But Gundam, what's initially interesting is that like the initial show release of this is actually a flop. It's not particularly well made. It has lots of budgetary issues and so on and so forth. It's quite literally the toy and model kit line that saves this and leads to it becoming the dominating force in the genre that we have today with 50 TV series, films, OVAs, manga, video games, an entire toy line, so on and so forth. And the last one that we need to pay some mind to in talking about this definition is a series called Macross. Macross is another one of the longest running Mecha franchises, and while it hasn't quite received as many entries as Gundam, Macross is significant for a number of reasons. This is the one that really kind of pioneers the concept of like mechs that transform themselves in a way, and what's interesting about that is Macross creator Shoji Kawamori is also a mecha designer for a series called Diaclone, and specifically one of his toy designs for transforming robots in Diaclone called Convoy ends up getting imported to the West and ends up being called Optimus Prime, the lead character of Transformers. So Macross is also significant because in a lot of ways it ends up being a lot of North Americans' first introduction to Mecha, because what famously happens is the company Harmony Gold licenses it, and two other shows in the same company completely rewrites the plot to those other two shows to make them all string together, and releases it here as a series called Robotech. And the ramifications legally of this happening are still ongoing today, where Harmony Gold continue to like cause problems for releases of Macross here. Although it was just recently announced, almost all of Macross is going to be on Disney Plus soon. So this is actually very timely. You can finally get to experience this. Except for the best movie in the entire bunch, Macross Do You Remember Love, which is still not being allowed here because of Harmony Gold. I'm not subtle about the fact that I hate them.
Same.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad at least someone chimed in on that. Through shows like this, we get the other side of Mecha, which is what is often referred to as real robot. Now, real is kind of putting it like, that's a very big stretch on the use of the term real. There's plenty of reasons why we don't have bipedal giant walking robots here. Most specifically, gravity doesn't really lend to that working properly, among other things. But real robot, what it really comes to mean is this idea of these are shows that feature, like more human-like characters. It's more often a war story or about open conflict. Kawamori specifically says about Macross that he wants to tell a mecha series from the perspective of basically the people caught in the crossfire, not from the people piloting necessarily. So this is kind of what ends up defining mecha, and it's through the advent of these two sides, but especially Real Robot, that we get the mecha explosion that comes in the 80s and 90s, and where it ends up dominating anime for quite a large period of time. So, thank you all for staying awake through the history lesson. Hopefully that was good. What we're going to talk now about is, the literal title of this thing, why does it hit different? And not just because it hits by throwing its fist out with a rocket propulsion thing behind it. But there's a couple of reasons why I think, now obviously, I'm going to start this by saying, by putting myself up here and positing myself as an expert on this, I do not have all of the answers as to why we like things. I don't know that anyone does, but I can try to make a bit of an educated guess as to why it is that stuff like this really takes off. A big factor with mecha, it is very uniquely Japanese. A lot of anime that even kind of first makes its way here or ends up being influential here often has some level of influence when it comes to like stuff from the West that's influenced it. Like I said, Astro Boy is inspired by Superman. Some of the earliest magical girl series are inspired by TV shows like Bewitched and stuff like that. Whereas Mecha really kind of comes about as a Japanese thing, and that's really what ends up lending it, a lot this kind of allure when it comes over here, and really makes it kind of unique. For instance, this is the first full-size Gundam statue built outside Diver City, Odaiba in Tokyo. They have since replaced it with an even more elaborate one and a moving one in another spot that I will get to. But suffice it to say, it's very uniquely Japanese. And don't take my word for it on that one. Take the word of the Japanese government, because their Agency for Cultural Affairs in 2014 actually commissioned an inquiry called the Japanese Animation Guide, The History of Robot Anime. There's quite literally a 90-page government document by the Japanese government talking about why Mecha is so big for Japan. And thankfully, through the efforts of wonderful, wonderful nerds on the internet, specifically Matt Alt, who is one of the best writers out there about Japanese media, and shares my first name, so you know he's a cool guy. He has actually translated the entire thing. You can find it online and read it. But specifically, the quote that's often highlighted from it is this comment from it which says, "Robot anime represents a unique form of popular culture developed in Japan. The sense of exploration and vitality inherent to the medium of robot anime is a reflection of the Japanese psyche." So again, even if you don't believe me when I say that this is big for Japanese identity, they themselves have said it. So, another thing that we have to talk about when talking about what makes Mecha so big, cross-media appeal. Now, as I mentioned, I'm volunteering at a booth where, if you want to for free, you can come build a robot model kit. And on top of that, if you really want to, you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars of your own money contributing to this hobby to the point that you have robot kits displayed all around your house. Not that I'm speaking from experience or anything, but anime in particular actually does lend itself well to this idea of all sorts of cross-media stuff. Now, this is gonna be, like, I'm sure everyone here knows about stuff like this at this point, this idea that, like, things interconnected between, like, anime and manga and merchandising and all that sort of stuff. But once upon a time, this was a very new concept. Like, pre the advent of the internet, pre the advent of things like, streaming and fan forums and all that sort of stuff, this cross-media thing was kind of unheard of in a lot of ways. And there actually is a term for it. Theorist Mizuko Ito, whose work, again, is very influential in talking about anime, actually coins this as the term the medium mix. And the medium mix is significant because it works, basically it talks about the combination of all these different factors within Japanese media that all feed off of each other. So you have anime, you have manga, you have the merchandise and all that sort of stuff, gaming, all these different things. Again, it doesn't sound new to us as a modern audience, but this really was kind of a big development that ended up allowing anime to really prosper. And Mecha in particular is really uniquely suited to making this happen, because there are so many even forms of mass media that other anime formats only really end up even diving into because of the success of Mecha. For instance, nowadays you can build model kits of Pokemon characters or Dragon Ball characters and stuff. We have Pikachu and Goku at the booth as well. But this comes about because of the success of Mecha model kits. And there are magazines devoted to model kit building and customization and the like. But it's not just models either. It's also things like video games. Video games are very rooted in the concept of going through a power fantasy. We like feeling powerful, we like feeling like badasses, and what's more badass than driving a giant robot? So video gaming in particular latches onto this very heavily, be it through adaptations of mecha anime and manga, like the Patlabor, the Mobile Police game released for the Famicom Disk System in the late 80s, or even something as recent as last year's Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon, Armored Core being the franchise that actually initially put the From Software company, who you all probably know better from Dark Souls and Elden Ring, on the map in the first place. So mecha has some legs in this genre. And speaking of cross-media appeal, some of you might not be familiar with this, but From Software once again, on the original Xbox, released a game called Steel Battalion, quite literally meant to be a mech simulator that included a 40-button controller and 3 foot pedals to drive the robot that cost as much as the console it was available for. Yes, I have a copy. It was new, too.
Oh my God.
And another big thing that we have to talk about is international appeal. Looking at this, you'd probably be inclined to guess this comes from from a manga cover art or something like that. But this is actually artwork taken from Catalyst Games' most recent entry in a largely Western series called BattleTech, which is a series of tabletop RPGs that have been in existence since the late 80s. And BattleTech is an example of we have our own takes on this here. Certain things don't necessarily get adapted the same way from Japan to the West. I don't see a lot of Western isekai out there. Not that it doesn't exist, but I don't see companies landing hand over fist to make their own version of Sword Art Online. You know what I mean? Whereas, Mecha becomes a thing internationally almost immediately. So for instance, as old as the 80s, we get the first iteration of BattleTech, which at the time was called Battle Droids. The name has changed very quickly when George Lucas's lawyers come knocking, and it's renamed to BattleTech. And funnily enough, they actually face a lawsuit at first because they very much blatantly borrow several of their mech designs from shows like Macross, and so Japanese lawyers get involved at that point. So, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, they say. But even going into the modern day, we continue to have our own Western takes on Mecha. Titanfall ends up being a release by a major publisher in the video game industry that is beloved to this day, and eventually leads to the creation of the series Apex Legends. But it's clear here that there is a fascination for this and for creating, separate versions of this that kind of transcends a lot of other media that we get from Japan. And similarly, Hollywood takes notice. And this is a big thing. So in the early 90s, we get an attempt at a mecha movie called Robot Jox. I can't necessarily say I recommend watching it. If you like things that are so bad they're good, it's a good watch. I would say in that regard. But that's effectively kind of an entry that we get for there. It's a massive flop. It does not take off at the box office whatsoever. But then, a little bit later, we get something from a beloved filmmaker, Guillermo del Toro, who is a self-admitted fan of anime and everything Japanese, making Pacific Rim, which could not be more of a Japanese mecha movie unless it was actually made in Japan. To the point that plenty of Japanese mecha creators were singing its praises online and demanding that people in Japan go see it. So the international appeal, I think, is really one of the big things that makes us aware of things like mecha, because of the fact that, again, plenty of other Japanese stuff does not come over in the same way. Or when it does, it's very much altered to kind of suit Western taste. Whereas a lot of mecha, that kind of happens a little bit with Robotech initially, but a lot of this other stuff, it's no, it's in the format that it's released in its original country. We just happen to really like it. And of course, to cap us all off, because you've all been very patient and I didn't want this to run too long, what is the ultimate rule of any kind of fiction? The rule of cool. And I think ultimately what really kind of lends this credibility to Mecha and why we like it so much, it's just cool. The notion of a giant machine that can move like this, it's just cool. This is a photo taken from the Gundam factory Yokohama in Japan, where they not only built a life-size Gundam statue, but this one actually kneels down and moves its arms and the like. And it stayed a tourist attraction for years, to the point that they actually kept it open a year longer than they originally intended to because it was still so popular. And thank God for that, because it actually meant I got to go see it last year. It was originally going to close the month before I was going to be going. So I was very happy about that.
Did it literally close today?
I think it literally closes today, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so apologies for that. But on that note, I think that's a pretty good summary of what it is that's significant about Mecha and why it's interesting, but I also very much invite you all to share your own thoughts, your own opinions, ask questions or anything. We hopefully have a little bit of time for a Q&A session. Oh, good, that only took half an hour. Okay, awesome. So we do have some time. But otherwise, if just in advance, if no one else has anything else they want to mention, thank you for paying attention to that. Thank you for listening. And I want to say that, should you want to look me up anywhere, you can find me online. I have several of my conference pieces and the like are online. I'm always down to chat with people about anime-related stuff or whatever. But thank you all in advance, but let's move to the Q&A period. I think I saw a hand up over there briefly. Okay. There's also a mic up front if anyone wants to ask a question, but yeah.
You don't think I replaced the Gundam factory in Yokohama with anything?
No idea. I have no idea. Unfortunately, I do not know if they're replacing it with anything. Yeah.
Do you guys ever assemble nightmare frames from Kojias at your building club?
So it depends basically on whatever people end up building. There was a recent build of, like a recent model kit came out of the Lancelot, so I personally have built that one. So yes, Code Geass is wonderful. It's a show that, again, if I had hours upon hours to talk about it, I'd highlight it, but I can't get to the important stuff. Does that now have it?
Does South Korea have anything to do with mechas?
So South Korea, as far as obligatory, as far as I know. But South Korea is interesting in that regard because we're starting to see certain some more Western takes come out, especially on anime as time goes on, and a lot of Western animation is actually done in South Korea nowadays because it's relatively inexpensive to produce compared. It's kind of the same reason a lot of Western cartoons were made in Japan for quite a few years. And I believe there was South Korean animation teams on things like Genlock, which was the Rooster Teeth mecha series that was done for a little bit. I think they had a South Korean animation team working on that. In terms of their own fiction, I'm not super familiar with any South Korean mecha, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And if it does, people are welcome to correct me because I'd really like to know about that. So, in short, kind of.
No. You count Attack on Titan as a mecha anime?
Yes. The question heard around the internet, is Attack on Titan a mecha anime? I personally say no, but...
So Ava's not a mecha anime then.
Ava is specifically a subversion of mecha anime. It does that on purpose. Attack on Titan, I don't know. I think the argument is a good argument. I can only give my personal view on it, but I don't think the people arguing otherwise are wrong in this case. Let's put it that way. So the folks in the back who have your hands up, you might have to come up and use the microphone just because I don't know if I'll hear you back there.
You want me to use the mic?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, what's your favorite mech anime?
Well, I was just told Neon Genesis Evangelion doesn't count, so that is my default response. It's been I watched that at 12 years old, and that really explains a lot about me, honestly. But talking about other good examples, if any of you were actually just at the Gundam Primer panel that we did a few hours ago, we talked actually about good ways to get into that series. I love Gundam. I love all sorts of other stuff. One that I recommend to a lot of people is Gundam the 08 MS team, which is just about a particular team in a particular war. You don't need to know anything else about that franchise to get into it, but it's beautifully animated. The characters are great. It has some of the coolest action sequences out of any of this stuff. So if I can't include Evangelion per the comments of some of the audience members, yeah, I'd say Gundam 8 MS team is probably my favorite.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So, where's the line between a mech suit on one hand and power armor on the other hand? From Samus to a Gundam?
Right. So again, I think that this is one of those things that there's room for debate. Power armor tends to be, number one, it's a lot smaller. Usually, even mechs with, that's another thing that's really fun about mecha anime, but also kind of dumb, is that the scale is all over the place in the mecha genre, because you have things like Armored Core, for instance, where the mechs are supposed to be about 15 feet tall, which is actually you know what, that's almost in the realm of possibility, but then you have a Gundam that's 40 feet tall, and it's quite literally at the Yokohama factory, there's an apology from the series creator that they couldn't make it walk, literally because that is impossible with how Earth's gravity is working currently. So all that to say is, to preface that, power armor tends to be more the kind of thing that's it's very localized around the person. It's meant to be roughly human proportions. The power armor in Starship Troopers that inspires Gundam is very much if you've seen the movie Edge of Tomorrow, it's very similar to that actually, where it wraps around a human being and it's controlled by human movements, not through a stick and controls and whatnot. A good exception to that rule in mecha anime is the Vision of Escaflowne from the 90s, which is a fantasy mecha series that everyone should really watch if you haven't seen it.
Also an isekai.
Yeah, also an isekai, and it has a banging Yoko Kanno soundtrack from the composer of Cowboy Bebop. But that's also one where these are giant robots, but are controlled with human movements. So there could be an argument that the Gaimelops in that one are more power armor. But I'd say that's kind of the distinction. Is typically more human-sized, more directly controlled by whoever's encased in it. It's meant to kind of be more of an extension of the person within it, as opposed to a thing in and of itself. Is kind of the assertion I would make. But that's actually a really good question.
Thank you.
I saw some other folks back there. Yeah.
Well, first
observation you just reminded me of was you mentioned how like some mechs looked scary looking. You remind me of a show I watched a few months back called Kaiser.
Mazen Kaiser is like one of the ultimate examples of that. Yeah.
And it kind of besides like Evangelion and Gundam, what other like shows shows would you recommend just in case like for those who somehow can't get into like say the most popular ones?
Okay. So general list of recommendations, God, that could really be the entire panel. Because we literally just did a panel on like just Gundam and like which one should you start with. But just for some general suggestions in terms of mecha, some of the things that I think kind of like might affect your choices are like how sensitive are you to like older animation and the like, because if you want to start with Gundam, that goes all the way back to the 1970s, and not everyone is gonna love very budget-friendly animation in the 70s. But in terms of a couple of good ones, just to kind of get a sense of what's going on, if you like Super Robot sounds like your jam. Like you saw Pacific Rim and you're like, I want some stuff with that. The modern adaptations of Mazinger that are available out there are very good. They stay pretty true to the manga. They're a lot of fun to watch. They're over the top. They're ridiculous. As soon as people hear over the top and ridiculous in terms of mecha, a series that always comes to mind is, of course, Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann, which is a wonderful entry point to mecha anime and like Super Robot especially by quite a few of people who worked on Neon Genesis Evangelion. It's kind of like the more optimistic, bright version to that one's dark subversion of the genre. So for Super Robot, Gurren Lagann is an amazing one to get into, and it's available out there. There is quite a bit of mecha available on streaming actually, and plus to boot, if you're someone who's interested in Gundam, for instance, the official Gundam YouTube channel actually often puts up entire series on there for free, and they cycle them routinely, so there's even stuff you can watch entirely for nothing, just on YouTube. But in terms of if you want to get into the real robot stuff, again, Gundam and Macross remain the mainstays. Macross in particular, the annoying thing is that they are tough to get in terms of like official formats now, though some of them will be coming to Disney Plus soon. But if you have ways of obtaining things through other means that I won't discuss,
Har fiddle-dee-dee.
I'm not going to say how. Two that are very excellent to do that are a bit older. One is the movie Macross Do You Remember Love from 1984, which is a retelling of the entire original Macross series, but it's a much more kind of like mature take on it. It's amazing. I actually screened it in my class. And another good one is the Macross Plus anime, which is a kind of like, it's in the distant future from the original series, so you don't really need to know about it. Macross Plus is notable because most of the staff that work on it would then go on to work on Cowboy Bebop. So, Macross Plus is a wonderful, and again, Yoko Kanno soundtrack, amazing visuals, cool dogfights, great characters, and if you watch the original dub, which I know some people are going to wince at that, you actually get to hear some early voice work by someone who you might recognize named Bryan Cranston. Breaking Bad himself. Because he was a voice actor before that. So anyone, any other questions? Yeah.
Color green sometimes uses auras in certain animes like Gal Geiger, Vizier.
God, why is the color green often auras around mechas? That's a really good question. I know it has to do in some cases with like playing off complementary colors and the like, because of the fact that like when originally the Gundam, for instance, because it's always known as being, like white, blue, yellow, red, it was actually originally supposed to be an entirely different color scheme, but they actually changed it to one that they thought would be more Western in nature to kind of like color it and make it look appealing. So I think in a lot of cases, like green is a color that really like sticks out in a jarring way against the colors that a lot of mechas end up being, because like there aren't a lot of red mecha, and usually it's like the main villain who gets a red one, and red is the complementary color to green. So I think that might be the basest explanation of it. It might just be for art purposes. Obligatory, I am not a visual artist. I cannot say for sure. But that would be my honest guess. And sometimes it's even a case of like, they end up reusing bits, especially in the olden days, they end up reusing animation and slides and stuff from other shows that didn't necessarily go on so well. For instance, the antagonist's mobile suit in the original Mobile Suit Gundam is red and pink because they had a lot of pink stuff left over from a previous show that did not succeed, and that suit was originally supposed to be blue, but they were like, no, let's use what we got instead. So I don't have an authoritative answer for that, unfortunately, but I can make some guesses. And there was a hand behind you, actually, that went up. Yeah?
Yeah, I just want to know, what's your opinion on the Super Robot Wars series?
Yeah.
The Super Robot Wars series, so for those who don't know, is a video game series that's like a tactical role-playing game that is basically Bandai and whoever they can license throwing all of these different giant robot series together in one thing. So you can have Evangelion Unit 1 fighting alongside the Wing Gundam, fighting alongside the Gurren Lagann, fighting alongside something from Full Metal Panic. I think, oh, actually, Full Metal Panic's another great series to recommend. It's part teenage high school drama, part war is bad mecha anime. That's a good one. But Super Robot Wars, I mean, they're a lot of fun. Like, if you're someone who's into mecha, like, you will find something to like about the Super Robot Wars games. It is kind of funny, though. We actually got a question about it at the Gundam panel where someone was like, oh, do those spoil the plots of series they depict? And the answer is yes, absolutely. If you are like me and you buy one for, like, the robots that you like in there, you better have probably already watched that series, because if you wanted to go in cold, you are not going to after playing that game. But Super Robot Wars is actually a great way to get interested in mecha in general. I discovered cool mechs from franchise I didn't even know about because I played some of those games. So yeah, if you want a great gateway drug and you're more of a gamer instead of an anime fan, like Super Robot Wars, go for it. The most recent one is on Steam and modern platforms. The other ones you kind of have to import to get them, but doing so is really easy because everything's region free now. Any other questions? These have been great questions, by the way. Thank you. You're a wonderful audience. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any examples of how kaiju media influenced the development of mecha media.
So that's a good question because kaiju, obviously it predates mecha by a good margin, especially in terms of production. And kaiju is also probably one of the more uniquely Japanese things. And kaiju also kind of gives rise to tokusatsu stuff as well, like the shows that would become Power Rangers in the West, but like the Super Sentai series and all sorts of other stuff like Gridman and the like. And I think in a way there is that kind of similar notion of that, like it gives it that sense of scale. Like kaiju movies and tokusatsu series and stuff are all about like literal things that are bigger than life doing battle with each other. Like Ultraman is not human sized; he fights giant monsters that tower over the city and the like. And that really is also like a recurring image in mecha as well. So I would go so far as to say that like we probably don't necessarily get mecha the way, especially Super Robot, I would say, we don't get in the same capacity if we don't have things like kaiju and tokusatsu series. There is some crossover sometimes that happens, like you will sometimes see like a giant robot doing battle with giant monsters. Actually, Getter Robo in particular does take inspiration from kaiju stuff because the enemies they're fighting through in the first chapter of Getter Robo is the Dinosaur Empire, which are like giant monsters that crawled underground during the time of the dinosaurs and are now re-emerging. So it's not robots fighting robots, it's robots fighting monsters. So I would definitely say that almost certainly takes some influence from kaiju, but I don't know how often they cross over, but like yeah, I don't think you get one without the other. Oh, thank you. And I think I only have a few minutes left, so I'll try to wrap up. But yes.
A little weird maybe, but where would you put stuff like, I don't know, Horizon Zero Dawn, for example, who takes inspiration from giant robots, but in a completely different, like, veering off from the traditional stuff?
Right. So Horizon is a real. I should have thrown that on the Western influence page because that's a really good one too. Horizon's kind of interesting because like usually one of the defining traits of mecha that people would kind of insist kind of has to be the thing is like the piloting nature of it. And Horizon is a little bit less like it's not so much people suiting up and fighting each other. It's like people surviving in a world where technology has effectively almost wiped out humanity. So I'd argue it fits more kind of into like traditional science fiction than something like mecha. But once again, I don't necessarily think you get the concept of robot dinosaurs that tower over you if we don't already have this concept of giant monsters and giant robots fighting each other. So maybe the term I would use is mecha adjacent, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's like, I don't know if I'd call it mecha, but I don't think it exists without mecha either. But it's funny you mentioned that because one of the members of our club is like a diehard Horizon fan as well. So like, I feel like though I should talk to them about this. They're probably gonna have a lot to say about it. Is that a hand up there? I see. Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, I unfortunately missed a lot of the presentation, but I was wondering if you mentioned mecha adjacent, but like, would you say there's maybe influences or ties to, like, when I think of anime like Heat Guy J or Bubblegum Crisis or Guyver?
Oh, Guyver's good.
Like, or just some other like 80s body horror stuff.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of, do you have anything to say about any of that?
So I think there is a connection. I did mention one, but I know you said you came in late, which is totally fine. Like there is a connection in the sense that like when Gundam is first designed, for instance, the main inspiration for that is the power armor suits from Starship Troopers. Like that's what Tomino directly references in creating that kind of concept. And someone did ask about power armor a little while as well, which is certainly what I would say things like Guyver falls into, as well as like anything where someone like takes on a mechanical suit to do battle with stuff. And that also has a lot of roots in things like Super Sentai shows and the like, because, you know, what's the first thing the Power Rangers do to fight evil? They suit up. And they're not mechanical, but they do seem to have some kind of powers and yada, yada, yada. But I definitely say, like, yeah, that's also stuff that I would certainly say takes inspiration from Mecha. I think the idea behind a lot of shows like that is the idea of, like, focusing more on the human element and this kind of, like, transhumanist integration of man and machine, as opposed to like transhumanism, for those who don't know, is like this kind of idea of moving to something other than traditional humanity, usually by integrating with technology. See Ghost in the Shell for probably one of the best anime examples. But I think there's maybe, for something like Guyver or something like that, there's more of that transhumanist angle of like, you know, humans integrating with machinery, whereas that's kind of kept a little bit more at a distance in a lot of mecha shows, because that's more like, okay, you have the human driving the robot, but the human and the robot are not necessarily linked in that sense. Evangelion obviously plays with that a bunch, and as do even some Gundam shows like Iron Blooded Orphans and the like. So I'd say that, like, again, that's another thing that probably you don't necessarily get in that same incarnation if you don't have Mecha, but it's got a lot of other roots in it as well that Mecha even kind of shares. And if you see someone else with a hand up.
I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, but Mecha Musume?
Mecha Musume, a whole thing that we actually, like, we have a few Musume experts at the booth. I don't know, I think one of them is even doing a panel on figurines and the like. Yeah, Mecha Musume is like an entirely different thing of like, what if adorable girls were also, you know, mass murdering robots? I will say this, yeah. Absolutely, there's definitely a lot of crossover in that regard. It's kind of funny you bring that up, because I remember first showing like Mecha Musume to my girlfriend, who like I wasn't sure what her reaction was going to be. She loves it. She's built about 6 Mecha Musume kits, and her exact summary of it was, and I quote, "It's cute, it's sexy, and it's badass. What's there not to like about it?" Which I thought was kind of a fun take, but yeah, you're right. That is kind of an interesting thing about how like that is still kind of qualified almost as mecha, but it's really like more along the lines of the other stuff that we mentioned. So I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, it definitely goes some places. It's fascinating. I feel like there's literally theorists that I've read that talk about the idea of the beautiful fighting girl in Japanese media. That's like a big thing that's also associated with, especially with anime. And I really do think it's just kind of a thing of like, Japan has never met a thing it can't try to put a pretty girl on and make it like appeal to just about everybody.
Or a cute animal.
Yeah, exactly. Or cute animal, exactly. All right, I think I have to wrap this up because I imagine someone else is going to need this in a little bit. But thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your questions. Those were amazing questions. And I hope you all got something out of this, because I had a good time at fucking class. So thank you. And again, if you want to check out some giant robots that you can build, come to the Plamod booth. You're welcome to come talk to me after this. I can hang around for a minute if you like, but otherwise, enjoy the convention.